The fluorescent lights of the 47th Precinct's locker room hummed overhead as Officer James Miller adjusted his badge, squinting at his reflection in the scratched mirror. 23 years on the force had left their marked silver threads weaving through his once dark hair, deep creases around his pale blue eyes, and a perpetual downturn to his mouth that spoke of too many hard days and harder nights. "Another day in paradise," he muttered, smoothing down his meticulously pressed uniform. At 52, Miller was what the department diplomatically called old school. He'd survived 6 police chiefs, countless policy changes, and most recently, a barrage of what he considered unnecessary sensitivity training sessions. The newest initiative, Building Bridges Understanding Implicit Bias, sat half completed on his desk, the worksheets blank after 3 weeks. The precinct around him was changing, and not in ways he appreciated. The newest batch of recruits included more women and minorities than ever before, their fresh faces and progressive ideas clashing with what Miller considered real police work. Just last week, Rookie Officer Sarah Chen had suggested community outreach programs in neighborhoods Miller had spent decades patrolling. "You don't understand these streets like I do," he'd told her dismissively. "Some people only respect authority." The morning briefing room buzzed with the usual pre-shift energy. Sergeant Rodriguez was discussing recent protests about police conduct in a neighboring precinct. "Remember, folks, we're under extra scrutiny right now. Every interaction matters." Miller snorted quietly, earning knowing looks from some of the other veteran officers. They were a dying breed, the old guard who believed in action over dialogue, authority over understanding. The tension between their approach and the department's new direction was palpable, creating invisible fault lines through the precinct. After briefing, Miller headed to Maggie's diner across the street, a ritual unchanged since his rookie days. The bell above the door chimed as he entered, greeting him like an old friend. The morning crowd was typical commuters grabbing coffee, regulars occupying their usual booths, the smell of bacon and coffee thick in the air. That's when he noticed the man at the counter, tall, athletic build, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Miller made in a month. He was black, and something about his confident posture, his expensive watch glinting under the diner's lights, set Miller's teeth on edge. "Excuse me," the man was saying to Terry, the morning manager, "but I've been waiting for 15 minutes, and I've watched several people who came in after me get served first." Terry, a white woman in her 50s who'd managed the diner for decades, flushed. "Sir, it's just how the orders came in. There's no need to make this into something it's not." "I'm not making this into anything," the man replied, his voice level but firm. "I'm simply stating what I observed. 3 people who came in after me have received their orders. I'd appreciate some acknowledgement of that fact." Miller felt a familiar heat rise in his chest. In his mind, this was exactly what was wrong with society today, everyone looking for offense, playing the race card, making everything about color when it wasn't. He'd seen it 1,000 times, or at least, that's what he told himself to justify what happened next. "Is there a problem here?" Miller stepped forward, hand casually resting near his badge. The movement was deliberate, a subtle reminder of authority he'd perfected over the years. The man in the suit turned, and Miller was struck by the weathered wisdom in his eyes, as if he'd seen this scene play out countless times before. "No, officer, there isn't. I was just leaving." He started to step away from the counter, dignity intact. Something about that dignity, that refusal to be cowed, sparked something ugly in Miller. Maybe it was the expensive suit that seemed to mock his modest salary, or perhaps it was the way the man carried himself with such self-possession. Whatever it was, Miller couldn't stop himself. "Yeah, that's right," he sneered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Go swing back to wherever you came from, monkey." The diner fell silent. The clatter of dishes ceased. Even the sizzling griddle seemed to quiet in shock. The man in the suit stopped, his back still turned to Miller. For a long moment, no one moved. Then the man slowly turned around. His eyes met Miller's with an intensity that made the officer's certainty waver for the first time. "I'm sorry, what did you just say to me?" Miller, committed now, doubled down. "You heard me. We don't need your kind stirring up trouble here." The man reached into his jacket pocket, and Miller's hand instinctively moved toward his weapon. But what emerged was not a threat, it was a badge, an ID. "I'm Marcus Thompson, the new chief of police for this precinct. I start today." His voice was steady, controlled. and you and I are going to have a very interesting conversation about your future in this department, officer." Miller's face drained of color as his eyes fixed on the badge. "Miller," he managed to choke out. "James Miller." Chief Thompson nodded slowly. "Officer Miller." "My office." 1 hour he turned to address the still silent diner. "I apologize to everyone here for having to witness that display of unprofessionalism. Please, enjoy your morning." With that, he walked out, leaving Miller standing there, his coffee forgotten, his world suddenly turned upside down. The diner remained silent for several long moments after Thompson's departure. Miller could feel every eye on him, the regulars who'd known him for years, the staff who'd always greeted him with smiles, even the rookies from his precinct who'd stopped in for breakfast. In their faces he saw shock, disappointment, and something worse, recognition, as if his words had confirmed suspicions they'd long harbored about him. Terry broke the silence first. "Your coffee's on the house, Jim," she said quietly, sliding a to-go cup across the counter. "Maybe you should head back to the precinct." The walk back across the street felt like the longest of Miller's career. News traveled fast in a police department, and by the time he pushed through the precinct doors, the whispers had already started. Officers he'd known for years couldn't meet his eyes. Some turned their backs entirely. The weight of what he'd done and who he'd done it to was starting to sink in. The neighborhood around the 47th precinct had always been a microcosm of the city's broader tensions. Gentrification pushed up against historical communities, wealth brushed shoulders with poverty, and race relations simmered beneath a veneer of urban progress. Miller had viewed these dynamics through a lens clouded by decades of ingrained prejudices and assumptions. Now, as he sat at his desk waiting for his meeting with Chief Thompson, those assumptions were crumbling around him. Through the window, he could see the community he'd sworn to protect and serve going about their morning routines. The Korean shopkeeper opening his store, the black teenagers heading to school, the Hispanic grandmother sweeping her stoop, all people he'd categorized and dismissed without a second thought. For the first time in his career, Officer James Miller felt something he'd successfully avoided for 23 years: shame. The precinct's main conference room had never felt so crowded. Officers packed the space shoulder to shoulder, an undercurrent of tension thick in the air. Word of the incident at Maggie's diner had spread like wildfire, and now everyone waited for the official introduction of their new chief, the man Officer James Miller had just called a monkey. Miller sat in the back row, feeling the weight of sidelong glances and whispered conversations. Officer Chen, who usually sat next to him during briefings, had chosen a seat across the room. Even his old partner, Detective Roberts, kept his distance. The isolation was new and uncomfortable, like a poorly fitted uniform. Captain Harrison cleared his throat at the podium. "Officers, as you know, Chief Williams' retirement has led to some changes in leadership. Today, I have the honor of introducing our new Chief of Police." He paused, his eyes briefly finding Miller in the crowd. "Please welcome Chief Marcus Thompson." The room stood as Thompson entered, his presence commanding immediate respect. He wore the same expensive suit from the diner, but now with his badge prominently displayed. Miller noticed details he'd missed earlier: the military bearing in Thompson's posture, the subtle signs of authority in his movement, the quiet confidence of someone who'd earned every step of his position. "Thank you, Captain Harrison." Thompson's voice carried easily through the room. "Some of you I've already met." His gaze didn't shift toward Miller, but the implication hung heavy in the air. "Others I look forward to knowing. But first, let's address the elephant in the room." The tension ratcheted up several notches. Miller's collar felt suddenly tight. "This morning I experienced something that many of our citizens experience daily. I was discriminated against because of my race." Thompson's words were measured, deliberate. "I could have been anyone: a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher. Today, I happen to be your new Chief of Police. The irony isn't lost on me." Murmurs rippled through the room. Several officers glanced at Miller, who seemed to be trying to sink into his chair. "But this isn't about one incident or one officer," Thompson continued. "But this is about systemic issues that have gone unaddressed for too long. When I reviewed this precinct's statistics before accepting this position, I found disturbing patterns. Racial disparities in arrests, use of force incidents, complaint dismissals, all significantly higher than city averages." Miller felt his defenses rising. These were the same statistics activists always threw around, ignoring the realities of police work. He'd argued against them countless times in the break room, defending the old ways, the need for aggressive policing in certain neighborhoods. Thompson began cycling through slides on the projection screen. These numbers tell a story, but not the whole story. They don't show the daily interactions, the small moments of disrespect, the casual prejudices that erode community trust. They don't show officers like Sarah Chen being passed over for tactical assignments despite top qualifications. They don't show Officer Rodriguez's community outreach proposals being repeatedly shelved. Miller shifted uncomfortably. He'd been on the committee that rejected Rodriguez's proposals, arguing they would waste resources. Changes start today, Thompson announced. We're implementing new training protocols, reviewing all departmental policies for bias, and establishing a community oversight board. Some of you won't like these changes. Some of you might choose to leave. But for those willing to grow, to learn, to be part of the solution, I'm here to work with you. As the meeting continued, Miller found himself wrestling with conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to dismiss Thompson's words as political correctness gone mad. But another part, a part he usually kept buried, remembered things he'd tried to forget: the look of fear in minority parents' eyes when he approached their children, the way some officers treated domestic violence calls differently in certain neighborhoods, his own automatic assumptions about suspects based on their skin color. After the meeting, the fallout was immediate. Officers gathered in small clusters, discussing the changes ahead. Miller overheard fragments of conversations that made his stomach churn. "Remember when Miller made that joke about the Asian delivery guy?" one rookie whispered. "Nobody said anything then." "I tried to report Jenkins for profiling last year," another officer muttered. "Got told to mind my own business." The break room, usually Miller's sanctuary, became hostile territory. His usual lunch companions found reasons to eat elsewhere. The few who acknowledged him seemed to be waiting to see which way the wind would blow. Detective Roberts finally approached him late in the afternoon. "Jesus, Jim, of all the people to pull that stuff with. What were you thinking?" "I was thinking he was just another troublemaker," Miller snapped. "How was I supposed to know?" Roberts shook his head. "That's the point, isn't it? Would it have been okay if he wasn't the chief?" Before Miller could respond, Officer Chen walked past, pausing briefly. "Chief Thompson wants to see you now." Her tone was professional, but her eyes held disappointment. Miller remembered how he'd dismissed her community policing proposals, wondering now if there had been merit to her ideas. Thompson's office, formerly Chief Williams' domain of dark wood and old police memorabilia, had been transformed. The walls now held photographs of civil rights moments, community gatherings, and what looked like Thompson's own family generations of Black Americans in uniform, serving despite the odds. "Sit down," Officer Miller. Thompson gestured to a chair. "We need to discuss your future in this department." Miller's defenses surged. "Chief, about this morning." "Save it." Thompson's voice was firm but not angry. "I'm not interested in apologies right now. I want to know if you're capable of change." "With all due respect, sir, I've been doing this job for 23 years. I know these streets." "Do you?" Thompson leaned forward. "Or do you just know your assumptions about them? Let me share something with you." He opened a file on his desk. "In the past 5 years, you've had 17 complaints filed against you for racial bias, all dismissed. You've used force against minority suspects at twice the rate of other officers. Your arrest records show a clear pattern of racial profiling." "Those numbers don't tell the whole story," Miller protested. "No, they don't. The whole story is worse." Thompson stood, walking to the window overlooking the neighborhood. "The whole story is about officers like you teaching newer officers that bias is acceptable. It's about good cops staying quiet because speaking up means being ostracized. It's about communities losing faith in those sworn to protect them." Miller felt his worldview beginning to crack. "So what now? You're firing me?" "That would be easier, wouldn't it?" Thompson turned back to face him. "One bad apple removed, problem solved. But we both know it's not that simple. The problems in this department, in this profession, run deeper than one officer's prejudices." The chief sat back down, studying Miller thoughtfully. "I'm giving you a choice. You can resign, walk away, find another job where your biases won't directly impact people's lives. Or you can commit to changing. Real change, not just keeping your head down until this blows over. And if I choose to stay..." Then you'll be partnered with Officer Chen in community outreach. You'll undergo extensive sensitivity training. You'll work directly with the communities you've marginalized, and you'll do it all under my personal supervision. Miller's pride wanted to resign on the spot, but something kept him in that chair, maybe the weight of 23 years on the force, or the realization that running away would only prove everyone right about him. "Why give me a chance?" he finally asked. Thompson's expression softened slightly. "Because if I don't believe people can change, I have no business being in law enforcement. The question is, Officer Miller, do you believe you can change?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Through the office window, Miller could see the neighborhood coming alive in the late afternoon, kids walking home from school, shopkeepers chatting with customers, life flowing in all its diverse complexity. For the first time, he forced himself to really look at the community he'd sworn to protect and serve, wondering how much he'd missed by viewing everything through the lens of his prejudices. "I don't know," he answered honestly, "but I'm willing to try." Thompson nodded slowly. "That's a start. Report to Officer Chen tomorrow morning. And Miller, this is your last chance. Make it count." As Miller left the office, he felt the weight of watching eyes. The precinct had changed in just one day, or maybe he was just finally seeing what had been there all along. The road ahead would be hard, but as he watched Officer Chen briefing a group of rookies on community engagement strategies, he realized it was a road he needed to walk. The old guard was changing, ready or not. The question was whether Miller could change with it. Officer Miller's first day with Officer Chen started at dawn in a part of the district he usually only saw through his patrol car window. The community center on Cedar Street was already bustling with activity, elderly residents attending Tai Chi classes, teenagers heading to early basketball practice, and community volunteers setting up for the morning food bank. "We'll be here 3 mornings a week," Chen explained, handing him a folder. "Chief Thompson wants us fully integrated into the community programs." Miller flipped through the schedule: youth mentoring, senior citizen outreach, community safety workshops, everything he'd dismissed as soft policing during his years on the force. "Listen, Chen," he started, but she cut him off. "Sarah. If we're going to work together, it's Sarah." Her expression was professional but firm. "And before you say this is a waste of time, just watch." Throughout the morning, Miller observed as Sarah navigated the community with practiced ease. She knew everyone's names, their stories, their concerns. Mrs. Rodriguez from the corner store showed them photos of her granddaughter's graduation. Michael, a teenager Miller had once stopped and frisked, was now leading a youth basketball program. Officer Michael approached him during a break, basketball tucked under his arm. "Didn't expect to see you here." Miller remembered that night how he'd pushed Michael against a wall, convinced the honor student must have been dealing drugs because of his race and neighborhood. The memory sat like acid in his stomach. "I'm learning," Miller replied quietly. "That's all I can say right now." Chief Thompson's influence was evident everywhere. The precinct's weekly meetings now included community leaders. Officers were required to spend time in neighborhood programs. Training sessions focused on de-escalation and cultural competency weren't just mandated, they were led by residents sharing their experiences with law enforcement. One session particularly struck Miller. A black father described teaching his 10-year-old son how to behave if stopped by police. "Keep your hands visible," the father demonstrated. "Don't make sudden movements. Say yes, sir, or no, sir, even if you're scared, even if you've done nothing wrong." Miller thought of his own son, now grown, and how different their conversations had been. He'd taught his boy to trust the police, to see them as heroes. The contrast made his chest tight. The turning point came during a domestic violence call in their 3rd week together. The victim was a young black woman, terrified to talk to the police. Miller watched as Sarah handled the situation with compassion and skill. But it was the woman's young son, hiding behind his mother's legs, who broke something open in Miller's heart. "It's okay, baby," the mother whispered to her child. "These officers are here to help." The boy's fear of him hit Miller like a physical blow. How many children had he made feel this way? How many families had he traumatized in the name of proper policing? That night, Miller couldn't sleep. He kept seeing that little boy's face, thinking about all the times he might have put that same fear into other children's eyes. The next morning, he requested additional community service hours beyond what Thompson had mandated. Sarah noticed the change in him. Small shifts at first. He started learning residents' names, listening more than speaking, catching himself before making assumptions. During their patrols, he began seeing the neighborhood differently. The group of young black men on the corner weren't suspicious anymore. They were Marcus heading to his job at the auto shop, Jamal studying for his JID, Travis taking care of his younger siblings. Chief Thompson's open-door policy meant officers could approach him with concerns or ideas. Miller found himself in the chief's office more frequently, not for discipline but for guidance. But I keep thinking about that, Father Miller admitted during one such meeting, teaching his son how to survive an encounter with someone like me. Thompson nodded. That's called awareness, Miller. The question is, what are you going to do with it? The answer came unexpectedly. During a community safety meeting, Miller stood up to address the residents, many of whom knew him from his old days. I've been a police officer for 23 years, he began, his voice shaking. And for most of that time I was part of the problem. I saw what I wanted to see. I let my biases dictate my actions. I hurt people and communities. He paused, making eye contact with Michael from the basketball program. I'm here to apologize, to listen, and to do better. The silence that followed was broken by Mrs. Rodriguez standing up. Actions speak louder than words, Officer Miller. We're watching. Yes, ma'am, he replied. That's all I can ask for. The changes in the precinct were gradual but undeniable. Under Thompson's leadership and Miller's unexpected example, other officers began to shift their approaches. The old guard's resistance weakened as community trust strengthened. Crime rates didn't magically drop, but cooperation and information sharing improved significantly. Sarah found Miller one morning staring at the community center bulletin board. Penny for your thoughts. I used to think this was all a waste of resources, he admitted. Community policing, outreach programs, all of it. I thought the only way to maintain order was through force and fear. And now. Miller watched as a group of officers played basketball with local teenagers, Chief Thompson among them. Now I understand that trust is the strongest force we have, and trust has to be earned. The real test of Miller's transformation came when a new officer, fresh from the academy, made a racist comment during briefing. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Miller. Once, he would have laughed along. Once, he would have defended it as just a joke. Instead, he stood up, placed a hand on the rookie's shoulder, and said quietly, "Let's talk. I've got a story to tell you." Later that week, Chief Thompson called Miller into his office. "I heard about what you did with Officer Brooks." Miller shrugged. "Just sharing some hard-learned lessons." "That's how change happens," Thompson replied. One conversation, one realization, one person at a time. He slid a folder across his desk. "How would you feel about helping to develop our new community engagement training program?" Miller picked up the folder, thinking about his journey over the past months. "I'd be honored, sir. But why me?" Thompson smiled. "Because the best teachers are often those who had the most to learn." As Miller left the office, he passed the wall of photographs, the civil rights moments, the community gatherings, the generations of officers. His reflection in the glass showed a different man than the one who had walked into Maggie's diner all those months ago. The uniform was the same, but the person wearing it had fundamentally changed. Outside, the neighborhood was alive with evening activity. Miller recognized faces now, new names and stories. He wasn't just policing this community anymore, he was becoming part of it. And in that transformation, he had found something he never expected: redemption. 2 years after the incident at Maggie's diner, a crisis erupted that would test everything the precinct had become. A white officer from another district was caught on video using racial slurs during an arrest, sparking citywide protests. As tensions mounted, the 47th precinct found itself at the center of the storm, with demonstrators gathering outside their doors. "They're calling for all precincts to deploy riot gear," Sarah Chen reported during the emergency briefing. The room was tense, officers exchanging uncertain glances. Chief Thompson studied the faces before him. "Officer Miller, what are your thoughts?" Miller stood, aware of the weight this moment carried. "Sir, I think we need to show them we're not the same department we were 2 years ago. Let me talk to them." Thompson nodded slowly. "Go ahead." Outside, the crowd had swelled to hundreds. Miller walked down the precinct steps, deliberately removing his tactical vest. The protesters watched warily as he approached the microphone that had been set up. "My name is Officer James Miller," he began, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd. "2 years ago, right across the street at Maggie's diner, I called our new police chief a monkey because of the color of his skin." Gasps and angry murmurs rippled through the crowd. Miller pressed on. "I was wrong. Not just about that moment, but about everything I thought I knew about policing, about this community, about my own prejudices. I'm standing here today because instead of firing me, Chief Thompson chose to show me a better way." He gestured to the diner across the street. "That incident could have been the end of my career. Instead, it became the beginning of real change, not just for me, but for this entire precinct. We've transformed how we police, how we engage with our community, how we address our own biases." Miller spotted familiar faces in the crowd: Michael from the basketball program, Mrs. Rodriguez, the young mother from the domestic violence call. Their presence gave him strength. "We're not perfect. We're still learning, still growing, still working to earn your trust. But we're committed to being part of the solution, not the problem. And if someone like me can change, there's hope for every officer, every precinct, every department willing to do the work." The tension in the crowd began to shift. Michael stepped forward, addressing the protesters. "What he's saying is true. This precinct has changed. They're actually part of our community now, not just policing it." That evening became a turning point, not just for the 47th precinct, but for the entire city. Instead of confrontation, the gathering transformed into a community dialogue. Officers and residents shared stories, concerns, and ideas for continued progress. Later that week, at the annual Community Police Awards ceremony, Chief Thompson took the podium. 2 years ago, an ugly incident revealed deep-rooted problems in our department. Today, that same incident stands as proof that change is possible when we have the courage to confront our biases and the humility to learn from our mistakes. He called Miller to the stage, presenting him with an award for community policing excellence. As Miller accepted it, he saw his reflection in the plaque's polished surface, the same face, but different eyes looking back at him. "The work isn't over," Miller said in his acceptance speech, "but now we know the path forward. It starts with acknowledging our mistakes, continues with genuine effort to change, and succeeds only when we recognize that true policing means being part of the community we serve." Across the street, Maggie's diner now hosted regular community police coffee meetings. The spot where Miller had shown his worst self had become a place of healing, understanding, and progress, a symbol of how far they'd come, and a reminder of how far they still had to go.